where borough boundaries are in London, and why should you? It includes places such as Wembley, Harleston, Wealdstone, Queen's Park, goes all the way up to Hollandale, Cricklewood, and right to the border with Harrow on the Hill. So it's an area of extreme affluence that houses in the south of the borough standing way above the 3 million pounds. Oh, sorry, start. And houses in parts of the borough selling, as I say, for over £3 billion, and some of the greatest deprivations in London and therefore the country in Cambridge and Harleston. We had, like all of the London boroughs, our local elections in May just gone, and quite incredibly returned 60 out of 63 Labour councillors. So we are very much a Labour council with a Labour philosophy. The 3 Labour MPs that cover the borough have majorities of between 16,000 and 30,000, so that tells you a little about the demographics of the area. We are the most diverse place in Europe, with 150 languages and a population which is 66% Black and Irish ethnic. I spoke this morning with our new cabinet, which are councillors, to discuss the major strategic priorities for the next 4 years for the council. And apart from just merely surviving because of cuts and austerity, because we were told last week that austerity is over, so you have to kind of take in a sharp intake of breath when you realise that means austerity being over for Brent means that we've lost £160 million worth of government funding already, and we're about to lose another £40 million. Anyway, having, despite just needing to survive, the biggest priority for our council, and everybody in the room agreed it, is housing supply. And when I say housing supply, what's really, really important for us is that housing supply is genuinely affordable, not just affordable. And genuinely affordable for me and for our council means social and council housing. And just to exemplify that, the average rate the average salary for people in Brent is £32,000 per annum. For a London borough, that's not a lot of money. The average 3-bedroom house in the borough is £872,000. That is 27 times more than the average salary in the borough. If there's 2 of you lucky enough to be in a job, of which many families who in need of affordable housing, that isn't the case, then that's 13 times your joint combined income. £32,000 a year equates to about £615 a week. The average market rent for a 3-bedroom house in the borough is £443 a week. The average local housing allowance, which is an allowance rate set by the government, which enables you to claim benefits as a part of that, is £340 a week. And the average social and council rent per week for a 3-bedroom is £131. And there is the difference in terms of what is genuinely affordable and what isn't affordable. So, I asked my colleagues starting tonight, could you just give me the government's definition of affordable housing, just very quickly and succinctly? And 3 pages later, with about 6 different definitions described down to minute detail, I decided I'd leave it to our 3 eminent speakers to tell you exactly what is meant by affordable housing. Anyway, so I'm sure tonight, I think this is one of the most critical issues, affordable housing, that impacts upon everybody who lives in this country. And for people to achieve their potential in life, having a home and a decent home is absolutely fundamental. It might be a fundamental human right. So, I'm hoping that our 3 speakers tonight will tell us exactly what they think we should be doing to solve the housing crisis. They all come from different walks of life. They will speak for 10 minutes each, at the end of which we will have a collective conversation, your participation being very, very important. And we'll do Q&A or general contributions all round. And we'll finish pretty promptly at 6:30. So our first speaker tonight is Lord Bob Kerslake, who sits in the House of Lords as a crossbench peer. Bob spent the majority of his career in local government, having been chief executive of both Hounslow, in London and Sheffield City Council. He was the Chief Executive of Homes and Communities Agency, which is a government agency, and he was then became the permanent secretary that was then Communities and Local Government, but now is the Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government, and he was also at the same time head of the Civil Service. He is now, among many other things, the chair of Peabody Housing Association, which is without doubt one of the most socially conscious housing associations in the country. And he's also chair of the Housing Regeneration Development arm of Bartlett and Council. So I think no one is better placed to comment on this issue and give a full national perspective than he.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event. Now, Carolyn said about knowing the House of Lords, which is true. People often ask me what I like most about the House of Lords, and I say I feel young again. It's a long time since I've been a young whippersnapper in any organisation. Most of it testify. Now, I wanted to start by saying affordable housing has been so used and abused by government that it has become almost meaningless as a term. Now, don't go home yet, there is more to be said about this. I think that became clear to me during the passage of the 2016 Housing Planning Act, which in fact, rather relatively, gave the responsibility for defining what we mean by affordable housing to the then Secretary of State, something extraordinary. So he has that in that act, the responsibility for defining it. This was, by the way, the same act that introduced a new type of affordable housing called starter homes, the Betamax of new housing supply, that shelter calculated would only be affordable to around 20% of the population in higher value areas. So when you include something of that nature in the definition of affordable, you can see that we have stretched it to the point of possibility, really. So it's a term I try and avoid using, and I think it's much better, therefore, to think about the different types of housing we have in this country: market sale, market rent, discounted sale or rent, such as shared ownership, and social rented, and then talk about access and affordability in that context. So you have to look at the different types of housing and the different markets that they work in to really have a sensible conversation about affordability. Now, what we can say, though, is that there has been an increasing challenge of access and affordability across all the different types of housing that I referred to, particularly for young people. And this was well illustrated, I don't know how many people saw this story, by the recent Institute for Fiscal Studies, a well-regarded think tank, which estimated that 40% of young people will never be able to own their own homes. That's an extraordinary change. When I came out of university and settled in London, it wasn't a question of whether I bought a home, it was where I bought it. That world has completely vanished for many people. So the story varies, of course, across the country. It will be different in Oxford to London. It's different in Sheffield, where my family home is, to Oxford. But the message, in terms of affordability, the growing lack of affordability, if you like, is the same. And that's the reason, if you like, housing has risen up the agenda for all political parties. And of course, at the root of this problem of affordability is the issue of new supply or the lack of it. Now, we cannot quickly build our way to affordability. Anybody who says you can is not understanding how housing works. So there's no quick fix to affordability in any of those groupings I talked about. But ultimately, the only sustainable answer to our housing needs is to increase the annual rate of build of all types and tenures, and here's the key point, to keep it there for a long time. This is, again, not a question of 2 or 3 years of increased supply, it's 10 years and maybe longer before you really truly start to make an impact.
And everything else that's done to fiddle around with the market is essentially palliative. Nothing else will sort out the core issue. And I think it's encouraging that all the political parties now have accepted that point as well. Now, I could say a lot more about new housing supply generally and the need for it to be part of essential infrastructure, but I'm conscious that I've got 10 minutes, and therefore what I wanted to use the rest of my time talking is to talk about one type of housing, and that's social housing. Now, if you're a follower of housing issues and you had nothing better to do during August, you will have picked up that there was a green paper published calling for a new deal for social housing. And it referred approvingly to the 1951 Conservative Manifesto, describing housing as the first social service. Now, that's a fascinating thing in itself. You have to go back to 1951 to find your reference point. But it's important to say, and it's worth remembering, that there have been 2 points in the very recent past when the supply of new social housing very nearly ended completely. It nearly stopped the supply of new housing altogether. The first occasion was in 2010 with the austerity measures of the coalition government and the cuts in capital spending. All capital programmes were ranked according to their cost-benefit return, and on the measure used, social housing fell below the line for funding, and would therefore have seen no funding. And it was only the introduction of the so-called affordable housing regime that involves 80% market rents of 80% of the market that we didn't see that budget eliminated completely from government funding. The second occasion where we nearly saw the end of social housing was the Housing and Planning Act, which sought to significantly extend right to buy to housing associations to fund the cost of those discounts through the forced sale of high-value council houses, the ones that are most in need for families and others, and then focus the affordable housing programme entirely away from new build social rented properties. And in a piece I wrote, somewhat in despair in The Guardian, I have to say at the time, I said that senior ministers in the government saw social housing as toxic, synonymous with sink estates, or Labour voters, or both. And I stand by those words from my experience. So it is quite remarkable how much the thinking has changed since Theresa May became Prime Minister. I think it's one of the very few welcome outcomes of the EU referendum. And the recent announcement that the cap on local authority borrowing would be lifted to enable local authorities to build more housing, something, by the way, that no recent Labour housing minister has been able to persuade the Treasury to do, I think completes a remarkable journey from a view that social housing was toxic to actually enabling new supply. But, and here's the point, there is a lot of catching up to do on social housing. If you want to ask the origins of social housing, it goes back to the 1800s. And in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, philanthropist George Peabody looked to provide housing for the labouring poor, for those in work that was of better quality than the existing slums. He put $500,000 of his own money into the creation of Peabody, a fortune at that time, with the purpose of ameliorating the condition of the poor and needy of this great metropolis, London. Move forward, and you see local authority house building taking off with Lloyd George's Homes Fit for Heroes following the First World War. The post-war Labour government built more than 1 million homes. 80% of those homes were council houses, 80%, largely to replace the damage done during the Second World War. And in the 60s, we have both high levels of public housing being built and high levels of private housing being built. Now, the nerd that I am, I remember 1966, not just for England winning the World Cup, but the point at which we built over 350,000 homes in this country. So we can do it. This is not mission impossible. We've done it before, we can do it again. But by the 1980s, we saw at its peak around a third of all housing being social housing, mostly local authorities. And so when you're at a third, you genuinely have mixed communities. Different occupations, postmen, teachers, others, lived in social housing. So at its peak, it was a third of our housing. But the impact of right to buy, combined with the central government cuts in funding for new social housing, drastically changed that picture. Between 1980 and 2013, more than 2.5 million properties were sold under right to buy. And so by 2011, the proportion of people living in social housing stood at 16%, less than half that peak figure of the 1980s. And that decline has continued to this day, falling by 150,000 in the last 5 years. So we've seen a dramatic shift. Now, has that been transferred into home ownership? No, it hasn't. Actually, home ownership has also fallen in recent years, and the difference has been taken up by the private rented sector, which has more than doubled since 2002. And the private rented sector serves an important need, but typically it has higher rents, much less security, and very often poorer quality stock. And in fact, those living in relative poverty in private rented housing are about a third, which has again doubled in the last decade. So there is a need, if we genuinely want to deal with affordability, for a radical change in direction. The lifting of the cap is great, but it's not enough. To deliver social housing, we need to do a lot more. And social housing should not just be a safety net for those who get into difficult times, but an essential tenure for those, around a quarter of the population, who do not and are unlikely to earn enough to rent or to buy. It should be seen in those terms, not in the current terms of a safety net. And to do this, we need to think about something like a quarter or a third of the 300,000 homes that are being planned per year to be social housing. And if I tell you that last year we built something like 5,000 homes in social rent, you'll get a sense of how big the challenge is. So to deliver this, we need to increase social housing funding significantly, reduce the dependence on cross-subsidy from market sales, which is not going to produce the same levels of surplus in the future. And on this point, Labour are right, we need to break, slow down, stop potentially the sale of right to buy. Otherwise, every house we build is almost simply matched by one we sell and lose to social rented housing. So just to conclude, the concept of affordable housing, I'm afraid, is intrinsically slippery, and I would invite you to go beyond that simple headline. And if we want a credible housing plan for this country, we have to address the issue of affordability for those on low income, and that means reversing the decline on social housing supply. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Bob, and needless to say, I agree with all of that. I thought I'd mention that in 1996, Eric Cantona was born as well, and of course, a celebration for some of us. Anyway, our next speaker is Paul Roberts, and Paul is the Chief Executive of Aspire Oxford, and that is an award-winning social enterprise and charity which works to get disadvantaged people into work and to live fulfilling lives. And to do that, they genuinely need and always need a home. And a lot of the work that Aspire are doing is on housing preventive. The government's put in place some trailblazer authorities, of which Brent is one, and Oxford City, and that is actually preventing homelessness. And I'm sure Paul will talk about this being one of, Britain's greatest housing hotspots. Rough sleeping is really dreadful. But the issue that some of us need to concentrate on even more than getting people from sweeping up is stopping people from being evicted in the first instance. So I'm sure Paul will really illuminate what's going to happen on that.
Thank you. And it's a real privilege to take part in the Urban Knowledge Exchange, actually. It's one of the great things about this evening is having that space for such an important debate, so thank you for inviting me, particularly on World Homeless Day. Good timing. So affordable housing, what makes a home affordable and for who? So I'm using my allotted time to make a direct pitch to all the millennials in the room, so which I scrape into actually in the 35 and under bracket, at least until Friday. So quick show of hands actually, how many people in here subscribe to the millennial bracket? Are you 35 and under? Okay, so look at about half. That's an interesting temperature test, isn't it? I'm also going to focus on the local, on Oxford, because that's what I'm familiar with through my work and living. A little bit about me. I'm a grandfather. I live with my wife and two small boys. We're lucky enough to be in our first home on the property ladder. It's a 3-bed semi in a typical market town outside of Oxford. We rented in Oxford previously for a number of years. I'm CEO of a growing charity in Oxford that seeks to tackle and prevent homelessness. We've done so for 18 years. So I employ over 40 people at the moment on the real living wage, not the national living wage, the real living wage or higher, many of whom have actually experienced homelessness. I also co-chair Oxford's Housing and Homelessness Group, and I'm on the steering panel for a new approach to tackling rough sleeping being developed by the City Conversation. So day in, day out, my colleagues are there supporting hundreds of local people who have been failed by the housing system and find themselves and their families on the verge of or experiencing homelessness. So I feel I can contribute something this evening. So what are good questions is for Oxford and particularly now? So it's the most unaffordable of English cities. House prices are 17 times average incomes, and it's a city well below the national average for home ownership. So it's 47% here against 63% nationally. I have an equivalent study to what Lord Kerslake mentioned, so the Resolution Foundation says that 1 in 3 of Britain's millennial generation will never own their own home. And that ratio is much higher still, I'd imagine, within Oxford. So the blunt truth is, that purchase of an affordable home feels utterly irrelevant. I'm not really going to focus on that at all this evening. I want to focus on home rental and how do you make that the new normal. So unsurprisingly, Oxford has a large private rental sector. It's 28% compared to the South East's 16%. And public policy has utterly failed to catch up with extraordinary changes in renting with its inherent insecurities. So in 2003, the number of children in owner-occupied housing outnumbered those in the private rental sector by 8 to 1. In the short space of 15 years, that ratio has now fallen to 2 to 1. So that's a seismic change. And eviction from the private rental sector is also now the leading cause of homelessness in this city. So given this is affecting many millions of children, including in Oxford, of course, we need to focus our attention this evening on what makes a home affordable and for whom in the private rental sector, and bear in mind millennial families in particular. So my attempt at the government definition, that when it comes to renting, is that affordable homes should cost no more than 80% of the average local market rent. So this definition evidently is not providing homes that are genuinely affordable for a huge number of people in Oxford on low or median incomes. Oxford City Council, for the record, state that the median private rent for a 3-bedroom house in Oxford is £1,425 per month. So at this 80% government definition, affordable rent equals £1,140 a month. But this is already 14% above the local housing allowance rate, which is £1,000 a month for that type of property. So what we've ended up with is a severe shortage of genuinely affordable accommodation, which simply cannot be met in the private sector, even with the availability of housing benefit. So what are the implications of this? So as things stand, an uncomfortably and rapidly growing large minority of you and your children will be forced to live and raise your families in insecure, privately rented accommodation for the rest of your lives, if you ever want to live in Oxford or a city like it. and millions of millennials will still be renting by the time we're claiming our pensions in this country. So for the privileged few who have brought their own homes, I include myself in that bracket for now, who perhaps feel bad but think it's nothing to do with them, well, we've all got to think again, because this crisis bites all of us and we will all pay for it. So the rising share of retiree renters, as they're now called, coupled with an ageing population, is set to more than double the housing benefit bill for pensioners, which is currently about £6.3 billion today, to £16 billion by 2060. 27% of all of our climate change emissions in this country come from poor housing stock, much of which is in the private sector. And if you're growing up in insecure housing, it has a long-term impact on children's life chances because of the effect of this disruption as insecurity has on children's learning and education. So the roots of the later problems, such as offending, behavioural problems in adulthood, often which my charity is currently dealing with on the coalface day in, day out currently, we work in the local prisons, for example, that can be traceable to behavioural problems that emerge when children grow up in insecure poor housing conditions. So we're building up and storing up what is going to be a much more prevalent problem. So everyone ultimately pays for failing to tackle this crisis, and we can't afford not to grip this on so many levels. So what can be done? Well, we want Oxford to be a city where all people, regardless of income, have access to affordable and high-quality homes that enable them to build settled, safe and healthy lives within sustainable and thriving communities, and nothing less than seismic simultaneous changes are needed. So I've mentioned before for a mass programme of house building to someone more expert, thank you, Kerslake, as essential as it is to build a new generation of good quality homes at low rents, and I'm sure Oxford City Council will want to lead the way now the cap has been lifted. And that's both for those at the sharpest end and for workers on low wages. However, Oxford City Council suggests 24,000 to 32,000 new homes are needed to meet Oxford's housing need by 2031, but estimates that only 7,500 of these can be provided within the city. So mass house building alone will never be enough. So we need to improve conditions for the millions of people, particularly families, living in the private rental sector, and that's in the here and now. We need that sense of urgency to this debate. That means raising standards and reducing the risks associated with renting through urgent tenancy reform. So we need to follow Scotland's lead and make indeterminate tenancies the sole form of contracting in Wales, replacing these 6-month or 12-month contracts demanded by most landlords. And this is standard practice elsewhere in Europe, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland. We need to tax foreign investors in rented property much more heavily, along the lines of Australia, where external buyers face levies of up to 15%. We need to control the rent increases, so they are linked to inflation only. We need to end the freeze on housing benefits and relink it back to rents. And the cap on people with more than 2 children also makes renting more unaffordable for families and needs to be scrapped. We need to acknowledge that universal credit is utterly failing vulnerable people and pushing them towards homelessness. Because what's happening is that they're falling into arrears through decision-making delays. These bills become instantly insurmountable. They get served a Section 21 notice and they're out. The systems also don't talk to each other. So if somebody's on universal credit and carers allowance, they're not talking to each other, at least in delays, and people get evicted. It needs to be binned. And we need to bring online every single viable unit of accommodation in this city and the county has to offer. This means effective guardianship schemes for empty premises to be put into meanwhile use, and more powers to councils to compulsorily purchase and bring back online long-term empty homes. Landlords, including Oxford University's colleges, I should add, need to be responsible and ambitious with the housing stock they own, but do not use for homes. This should be made available for social letting or guardianship. And we need to establish a new social enterprise lettings agency for Oxford that will accept housing benefit, not charge expensive tenancy administration fees, and be delivered with the dignity and respect for its tenants that they deserve. We will provide a clear pathway to accommodation to help people reintegrate into society and improve their and their children's opportunities and quality of life. But perhaps most importantly, what we need to acknowledge is the essential role of people and communities to be enabled and mobilised to take more leadership in realising how to create genuinely affordable housing in their areas. That's realising a cultural shift and it's taking the stigma out of rental and seeing it as an opportunity at the same time to address the entrenched inequality that Oxford finds itself in. Thank you.
you very much, Paul, and much of what you spoke about resonates very much with what we deal with on a daily basis. Actually, interestingly, in Brent, 50% of all housing is in the private rented sector. So that whole issue of regulating the private rented sector is extremely important. And that whole issue of people on universal credit, every time it's delayed, I think, thank goodness, because that's a wave more people who become homeless as a result of it. So I completely agree with the points that you make there. So our next speaker, I think, comes from a completely different background altogether, and will tackle issues, I think, from a different perspective. She's Professor Yolande Barnes, and she's chair of the Bartlett Real Estate Institute, which is based at University College London. She's got over 30 years' experience working as part of her time in Savills, and the research and the housing market in Savills, which is a really good research organisation. But they're looking at the movement of international capital in real estate, the impact of that, both socially, economically and environmentally, and how this impacts on very specific neighbourhoods. So with no further ado, I'll pass over to Yolande.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, I do have a different perspective, and I think what I really want to do in the next 10 minutes is to illustrate how, when we talk about the problem of affordability, we all think we're talking about the same thing, but as we've already heard, there are different manifestations of it. So we've heard at one extreme the awful problem of rough sleeping and homelessness. We've heard about social or subsidised renting, social housing or subsidised renting. But I think one of the big challenges we have, and this is a very academic thing for me to say, I've just moved from industry to academia, and it must be affecting me already, is actually we need to define what the problem is in order to be able to solve it. Now, I had the great privilege of travelling the world in my last job, and I can't think of a major city that I landed in where there were people weren't talking about the problem of affordability. This isn't just a UK problem, this is an international problem. And some of it stems from fundamental shifts in the nature, cost of money, and the rise of the millennial generation. So what we start to see is that the problem is different in different places and for different types of people. And consequently, I absolutely jumped at the chance when ULI, the Urban Land Institute in Europe, said they wanted to look at affordability. And we have just completed a pilot study looking at affordability of housing in different cities across Europe. So the problem, first of all, was to define what we meant by affordability. And I think one of the first lessons, the first things we learned, was that there's an incredible load of rubbish written about, certainly when it comes to comparing neighbourhoods or comparing cities, and certainly comparing countries, about what's affordable and what's not. There are many different metrics used which make comparison impossible, and some very, very dubious metrics, as official statistics don't actually exist in every instance. And I think at a UK level, what this boils down to is perhaps thinking of the differences not just between countries or between counties, but between cities. And in the case of big cities, the difference between different neighbourhoods. I think problems can show up very differently at a neighbourhood level. So at a very basic level, we have to think about the metrics we're using and then the areas that we're looking at and comparing. In the case of big metro areas, is it reasonable to look at the whole metro if it takes 5 hours to travel from one side of LA, for example, to the other? You can't actually look at the problem of housing affordability, even at city level sometimes. And then you start looking at what is affordability. We've already heard, the rate of increase is often cited as a problem. That's people's first go-to. Prices have gone up by X, incomes or wealth only by quite wide. So there's an absolute price level people want to look at. And then we've already heard the house price to income ratio being cited. But quite apart from the fact that people mix up individual earnings and household earnings and so on, we found that what really mattered is household disposable incomes. That's what we need to look at. We probably need to look at them on a kind of travel to work area basis. And a lot of the affordability problem as framed by many a millennial, or indeed many a bank of mum and dad, is that people lack the equity, the deposit. And when we went on to actually do the research and run the figures and get the data together in many of these cities, we found that in every city and for virtually every group that we looked at, the cost of financing a mortgage was way, way lower than the cost of private unsubsidised renting. So the affordability is kind of created by barriers to entry to certain types of tenure rather than by absolute price levels or even incomes. So there are also other things that I think we need to look at when considering affordability. The extent to which people have to crowd into places. We find very often in most cities, a lot of young people are very happy to share a house or a flat, and sometimes with complete strangers. As they get older, not surprisingly, want more privacy of their own home, maybe a family, that just can't work. So ways that some groups in the population are coping with affordability issues aren't tenable for others. Also, we found commuting, long commutes, as one of the ways that lack of affordability. Another way that sort of lack of affordability shows up. It's not always in the absolute price you're paying in rent or mortgage. But young people in Barcelona, we found, have to move at least 50 kilometres out of the city to be able to afford a place. And in Barcelona, that's a long way because there's less public transport than there might be in other European cities, for example. So there's even I think going beyond housing policy, social policy, financial and fiscal policy, we may even have to be looking at public transport and infrastructure policy, as means of solving some of these affordability issues. And then, of course, there's the issue of active displacement, people just being displaced from neighbourhoods that they were born and brought up in. The third dimension that I want to bring to bear here is also that there are different impacts, as I've mentioned before, on different groups of the population. So we found the impacts vary by income, and we looked specifically at lower quartile household incomes, disposable incomes, medians, and upper quartiles to try and understand some of the differences. And this may strike you as somewhat controversial, but in some cities, I think including London, the pressure was greater on the middle income, where there was some housing, social housing provision. So in Amsterdam, in London, where there was social housing provision, versus, for example, Barcelona, where there was much less, we actually found that it was the middle income people who were paying a greater proportion of their household income on housing. So we're taking care of the upper income. We're taking care to some extent, in as much as planning Section 106s and so forth have provided some social housing. It's actually the middle income in some cities that's really feeling the squeeze. There's also the thorny question of the indigenous versus the incomers. I'm talking here about immigration. I'm talking about people who are in social housing in a neighbourhood or in subsidised housing. So, for example, if you look at San Francisco, this is the most extreme example I know, but San Francisco has the highest rents we've found in any city anywhere. And it also has very strict rent controls. And what we find is that those rent controls benefit hugely the people who are lucky enough to have a rent-controlled apartment or house. They're paying low amounts, But what it does is discourage any new landlords from the private sector, and that's all there is in the US. So consequently, the new incomers, which there are many in San Francisco, due to the digital boom and what have you, they are paying through the nose an absolute fortune. So you can see, even within the same tenure, certain policy responses have unintended consequences, which we have to be really mindful of. And I'm making this deliberately confusing and complex just to try and show how, where we fiddle with one area of policy or one type of tenure, it may have knock-on effects. And we can't just find, unfortunately, much as we'd love to, find the single silver bullet solution to all of this. There isn't one. Undoubtedly, temporary housing, help with permanent housing, some forms of social intervention, building new subsidised housing, perhaps by local authorities, perhaps by housing associations, a combination, is undoubtedly part of the solutions. But what I'm trying to show here, there are many, many others that we need to address and think about. And I should point out that actually, despite Sydney, well, the Australian rules not allowing any overseas buyer to buy second-hand property, they can only buy new build. And despite those stringent taxes, actually, lack of affordability, especially for millennials, is probably worse in Sydney in some cases than it is in some UK cities. So, you can't solve the problem with just one populist sort of tax measure or something that looks good. You really have to understand the incredible complexity of this issue, how it impacts by different household types and different age groups of population. The problems of affordability for retirees are very different to those of the millennial and younger generations. And one thing we didn't tackle, we've tried to sort of cover all of this and describe the issues and find a methodology and a framework for describing all these issues in the ULI research. But one thing I will be looking at much more closely is the impact of building certain types of property. So when we build a housing unit, everybody sort of says yay, and what we don't understand properly and don't measure properly is the costs of owning, whether it's the landlord, social landlord, or an occupier, of owning that property in the future. And we found some quite frightening things in the little bit of work we've done on this, that the ongoing costs, the service charges of some of the type of stock that we've been building in the last few decades is actually going to start rearing its head as a big affordability problem. Actually finding the service charge, finding the money for recladding or redoing the common parts and all that sort of thing. And that's for landlords and tenants, but ultimately it's an affordability issue. So I've not provided, as the others have, any answers here. I think, and I hope I've kind of thrown a load of problems at you, but I'm trying to illustrate just how carefully we have to think about any intervention that we do make. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was incredibly thought-provoking as well, and actually made me think your intention, Yolande, and also Paul's as well. If you think about the number of people whose social care in their old age is paid for from owning their home, it's very important that we need to think about that going forward, because for these people who in the future will not own their home, their social care costs are going to fall predominantly on the state. And if they have got unaffordable service charges going forward, and you're on a limited pension, that becomes even more difficult as well. So I think there's some really, really important social policy issues that arise from all of these issues. So it's your turn now to make your contributions. Take no notice of me. You go first.
Okay, I thought rather hasty, that just proved it. My name's Susan Parr. I'm from the University of Hertfordshire, and I also work at the International Garden Cities Institute. I thought it was really fascinating to see that we're still talking about being on the property ladder. If we're going to really reshape how we think about tenure, and Yolanda's points, you point out the complexity of that, we really need to change the language, I think. I also think we ought to be talking about place, and I thought, Yolande, you kind of started to do that. So I'd love to know what people think about situating housing within placemaking, because we can see, despite some successes in a way of all that house building in the post-war era, it also in one way constituted a massive failure in placemaking terms, some would argue. So I'd very much be interested in your thoughts on that.
Right, so we'll hold that thought on placemaking. Kathy, you wanted to contribute?
Yes, it was just a point of clarification for Yolande. I didn't quite understand that. Did you say that the issue of affordable housing was hitting middle-income families more than lower income?
In some cities, yes.
Okay, maybe you could explain how that happens.
And the gentleman next to you, Kathy, if he could do his, and then we'll get responses to those three. I've got another 3 people indicating.
My name is Michael Howler. I last met Bob when he was at the HCA and I was at the University of Salford. But before that, I spent many years carrying out academic research into social housing and looking at the history of social housing in a number of countries in Europe and America. Essentially, throughout the 20th century, there were 2 models of social housing. One was mass provision for perhaps 30 to 40% of the income distribution. And the other was residual provision, which was for those who are largely socially stigmatized. And the fact is that over the last 100 years or so, it's been the limited residual model that's tended to dominate. There were really 2 periods when mass social housing was developed by governments. One was in the social and economic crisis after the First World War. Bob's already referred to this. And the second was the 20 or 30 years after 1945, linked very much to economic development, reconstruction and economic development. In other words, the policy of mass social housing was not really determined just by housing needs, but by some broader social and economic crisis. And I happen to think that we will probably not get back to the mass model I think we need, and Bob thinks we need, and others do, unless we can see it in the context of some broader societal events. And my question is, can you see in a post-Brexit Britain the possibility of that occurring or not?
Gosh, well, those are 3 very, very deep issues. I'm going to ask Yolande in the first instance if she would just clarify that point, Kathy, and maybe expand on it, and then pass over to Bob on the placemaking issue, I think in particular, and the social housing, and also to yourself as well.
Okay, your point about the ladder, completely taken. I think the housing market ladder, so-called, is broken. There are very few rungs on it, and most of them are broken and out of reach of a huge number. So point about language, absolutely noted. And going on from that, I think the need to, as it were, invent new forms of occupying housing is very needed. And at the moment, if we talk of new build housing, we're talking of a very, very limited model. People call the house builders mass house builders. They're not, they're niche house builders. They build probably 10% of the population at any one time. And little crumbs of social housing can fall from that very rarefied process. We have to, if we are going to follow this in the sort of numbers Bob talks about, we have to be talking about new, whether it's cooperative, land trusts, part ownership, whatever. There are a whole load of new models to be made, which kind of links into the point about the middle income people. In some cities where there is adequate, or not adequate, sorry, a higher provision of social housing, you find there's a section of low income households that can access that, in which case the pressure on them is not as high as it is on a middle income owner who isn't able to access that subsidised housing. And as a proportion of household income spent, it can actually be a lot higher, say a young family in suburbs or whatever. I do just want to, because I count myself an urbanist, so the placemaking point I think is incredibly well made. And I think it is worth saying that when we built those 350,000 units a year, we demolished over 200,000. And we built the new houses at a lower density than the streets they replaced. Which raises a point which I think is that the word land is very rarely used here. But if we're going to build new houses, we're going to have to build it on land. And land has been released into the system in the form of what I call Eeyore's gloomy place. I think somebody else coined that, but it's the bit of land next to the bypass on the edge of town that's then developed pretty homogeneously. Or it's the brownfield. I knew UCL's new campus is at here East, so I had the misfortune of passing bits of New Stratford every day, and even in the glinting sunlight this morning, I couldn't help but think of a kind of something rather Soviet. We're not building more of the places that we know that people want and like. So we're not building London-like neighbourhoods in London. We're not building Oxford-like neighbourhoods. And how less worse would Oxford's affordability problem be for some people if Didcot wasn't just such a should we say compromised place? That's my polite word for it. So I could go on, but if we build new supply, we've got to build really good places.
Just stop before you offended anybody else where they might live. Please stop.
It's okay, I live in Farringdon, not Didcot, so
Okay, I'll make 3 points because I know there'll be a lot of people who want to come in. On the part about place, absolutely right. It's something I'm passionate about, and if we came back again, I would give you I'd be happy to give you at least 10 minutes and a lot longer on the issue of place. We've learned a huge amount about how to get that right. We've got to be careful to say not all the housing that was built in the 60s didn't work, having taken the places where it worked very well, and many of the reasons where it went wrong were not about the housing design, but the quality of investment subsequently. But I think place is critical. It's not just the place in i.e. Oxford, it's the individual developments. And for Peabody, it's just axiomatic that we build good places. But as I say, we've learned, and you go around some of the developments, of course I would say this from Peabody, but I think not just us, others, you can see genuine new communities being created, mixed tenure, diverse places that are really working. So we mustn't, in a sense, beat ourselves up on this. We can do it, and we do it in many, many places, actually. But it's a skill, and you have to learn it, and you have to constantly improve on it and develop it, in my view. So that would be my point about that. Maybe another time we could do a session on that. The second point I wanted to make really was a broader point about housing. Yolande's absolutely right to say the housing market is very complex and it's very place specific and so on. But I think the thing I've felt much of my time in government and in local government is that can often therefore lead you to think kind of nothing can be done. And so therefore you sometimes have to look at some big direct things. That's my view very strongly, that you have to, there's no one silver bullet, but maybe we need half a dozen silver bullets. We need to actually seriously say this is a crisis, it is a crisis of infrastructure. We are going to take some bold actions on the private rented sector and so on. Which kind of brings me to the point that was made here. Are we facing the same, we're not facing the post-war crises, of course, but I do think we are facing a significant point of social and economic crisis in this country. And I point you to a commission that I was involved in. I don't know how many people have read or heard of it, called the Commission for Economic Justice. And if you haven't read it, I would strongly recommend you do have a look at that report. Because it lays bare, I think, the scale of the, below the headlines, the scale of the economic challenges this country faces, and the sense in which a large number of the population think that the economy has stopped working for them. And I think, therefore, the issue of housing is one manifestation of a much bigger issue. that we need to deal with in this country. And this is not a parliamentary point, I'm simply saying that almost every party can detect the sense of frustration and alienation there is across the population. You either end up with simplistic solutions like leaving the European Union, or you confront some of the deep structural problems of the UK economy and try and improve on them.
Paul, final word on that? No? Okay. All right, so we have a gentleman over here, I think, who wanted to ask a question. Gentleman here, and the lady here, and then I'll come to you the next round. Okay.
In June, I declined a national daily asking me to write an editorial on the back of the Grenfell Tower anniversary. But last Thursday, I was dragged kicking and screaming to the BBC studio to address this serious issue, whether housing can ever be described as local or national. Because if we look at the lessons that we should pick up from Grenfell, even before the inquiry submits the report, is that housing, health, and education are core issues that nobody should even begin to debate now. We should make an assumption that if we can't house ourselves, we are not literally as civilized as we may think we are. Don't you think it's far more serious than just the lifting of the cap so that local authority can be? Because we lost lives, and we can never replace those lives.
Thanks very much. A sort of technical issue, I suppose, but quite related to the lady's question here. To what extent is the proportion of household income spent on housing the right measure for affordability? I have in my mind an alternative which would be something like the real amount of income left after housing costs, which I think would explain the sort of slightly counterintuitive idea of the squeezed middle in that circumstance, in terms of the amount of money people have left over after they spent they paid their mortgage or rent. I imagine the middle is still considerably better off than the people at the bottom end. The flip side of that is, over time, my suspicion is that the housing crisis would look less bad based on that measure, in that overall median incomes have been rising at the same time. So it's not something I've not looked at in terms of before and after housing costs, but just a sort of a technical question, but I think that one that relates to our sort of gut feelings about what's, where people's standards of welfare are at.
So, thanks for that question. And before we go to the lady from here, one of the things I would say about that in terms of poor people and middle-income people, we were doing an assessment of a woman she's a single mother with 4 children between the ages of 13 and 12. She gets housing benefit, but a small amount of housing benefit. She obviously doesn't work because she can't, for a single mom with 4 kids. She cannot, under any circumstances, afford to live in the London Borough of Brent. So that whole issue of where can that family afford to live, where are they prepared to live, very, very difficult. But just while we're talking about that issue of people's income, the assessment that is done as a national assessment of how much she needs to feed her family of 5, including herself, per week. Can anybody imagine what that is on food a week? Well, it's £40 for a family of 5 on food a week. So I do think we need to think about the extraordinarily poor people who are living in our communities and the impact of housing and housing costs on them. Anyway, this lady here.
So my question is about the available land that's affecting the housing supply in general. So I think globally now there's quite a big discussion that the planning regulations on the land is somehow affecting the housing price. For example, in London, there's the green belt areas for a long time where it's affecting the land supply and affecting the housing price. And in China, in the big cities in China now, in the big cities, government now is like reducing the land supply to curb the urban sprawl. So that's also similar to like the London case. So I wonder, from your perspective, the practical and also clinically, like here in Britain, that how much this planning regulation or this perspective is, how much is affecting the housing price here, or the availability, affordability in general.
So, three really excellent questions, and I'm going to start with Paul this time.
Just in terms of the point the first gentleman was making around seeing how housing is just linking it to these very core issues, and that's what I was hoping I was trying to get across in my point, is that you can't divest housing from health, from children's education, from the impact it has on particularly families and children from the very outset. We need to start thinking about homes, affordable homes, good quality homes, from the beginning with that mind frame. I mean, Grenfell was a particularly awful reminder of why that's so critical, never to turn back in terms of how we approach that. Just in terms of land, I think what would be very much needed is more transparency, of course, around land ownership, and of course there's an integral link between ownership of land, planning, seeing it as an investment portfolio opportunity. So I think opening up transparency around who owns land, what possible availability is there for making better use of land, how do you incentivise land that's being held to be built upon. These are all very crunchy, critical issues that need to be tackled, and no less relevant in Oxford and Oxfordshire, surrounded by wealthy landlords and landowners within the university and colleges within the city. So yeah, it'd be very fascinating questions to tackle.
So, Paul, would you be able to tackle the planning issue that was raised?
Yes, I'll say a few words about that. Perhaps also this part about squeeze middle as well. Yes, land is critical, and you need planning regimes that enable land to be brought forward. Indeed, the changes that were made into the planning regime, and it's worth saying that the planning system gets reviewed pretty much every year, for as long as I can remember. But I do think the changes that were made to require local authorities to identify their forward land supply were important changes that will help with this issue of supply. What I would say, though, is perhaps kind of 2 points on that. One is there is actually an ability to deliver more supply. If you take London as for instance, we are responsible for an area called Thamesmead in London. We could double the number of houses. It's exactly as Yolande said. Some of the developments have the combination of being very poor environments and yet very low densities. Extraordinary, really. So there's ways through that can be addressed, but they need investment in infrastructure. So when we talk about land and the availability and unlocking of land, it does require a commitment to invest in new infrastructure to take advantage of those opportunities. And on the question of the Green Belt, actually I do think the Green Belt needs to be looked at in London. Indeed, that was something I argued in a report for IPPR. And I think it needs to be particularly looked at near transport nodes. That's such a wasted opportunity. And the whole point about Green Belt was not the creation of green spaces, it was actually to prevent urban sprawl. And you could still do that and look sensibly at the way Green Belt works. And it's just a matter of time before the political parties realise that the pressure on housing outweighs the resistance to developing on some aspects of the Green Belt. I can say that because I'm not going to be elected anytime soon, but I do seriously think that's an issue. I just want one type on the squeeze middle. If you're in social housing, you may well face less financial pressures, but the whole point in a way is that the decline of social housing means that those who were previously able to occupy those houses move into private renting. And exactly as Carolyn has said, their life is hell. I mean, just not put a beat about the bush, Carolyn. It is, talk to any family in that situation. Paul made the point very powerfully. Why are people going homeless? It's because of evictions from short-hold tenancies. You know, they have absolutely every aspect. So compared to the squeezed middle, you know, I absolutely get the squeezed middle point. I think they are the ones I worry most about, if I'm honest.
Yeah, me too. Yolande, any comments that you'd like to make?
Yes, like the idea of the residual after housing, but I think we came across sort of young families paying 65% of disposable, the after-tax disposable household income on housing, so that's not a lot left at all. Well, at a median income, it's not a lot. The median is not riches, so I think we do need to concentrate on or pay more attention to the squeeze middle. I wanted to make a point about Greenbelt and London. I think I'm not particularly wedded to the idea of never touching the Greenbelt, because a lot of the Greenbelt isn't green and does, you know, denuded environments anyway. But what I do want to point out is something that's very little spoken about, which is what I call the blue collar around London, which is a degentrifying suburban environment. And Bob very aptly talked about densification around transport nodes. That's not just a Greenbelt issue, that's a suburban issue. And the capacity that certainly London has, because we've done the work, to densify around transport nodes, create real London-like urban neighbourhoods around these very well-connected nodes. We calculate very conservatively, actually, that there's capacity there for 1 million new additional dwellings. Over 1 million, actually, about 1.3. Now, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. In order to do that, boy, you'd have to do things differently, because the way we do things now just won't deliver that. It means allowing neighbourhoods, groups of neighbours to get together to land pool, to do some really innovative stuff. It means really proactive neighbourhood level planning, which we just haven't seen in this country. I don't think ever, actually. It does happen to some extent in other countries. But there's a whole series of things: finance, the land, the people, the incentives, the planning system. You know, all has to come together. You want the half dozen silver bullets. You have to make sure they're not hitting each other and ricocheting off in different directions to get that done. But there is capacity there.
A neighbourhood plan in a part of Brent, which I think when Bob was Urban Secretary was introduced the whole issue of neighbourhood plans. And that community came together, and the sole purpose for them coming together to have a neighbourhood plan was to stop any further housing development in the area. So the irony of it all. So we've got a gentleman here who wants to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So my suggestion is, because we've got a remaining 10 minutes, we take the 3. And it's now 7. Is it now 8? So I think on that basis I'm going to do 4 and 4. So if you'd like to start, thank you.
Jim Smith from A2 Dominion. It's a housing provider, based in Oxford, London and South West. You probably know us. Just following on from the planning perspective, isn't it about time we remove the planning spectrum from the political spectrum and allow planning officers to actually get on and do what they're really good at?
Adrian Arnold, I'm Head of Planning Services at Oxford City Council. So I would agree with that statement wholeheartedly. On a serious note, planning is getting much better. The planning crew work is changing things, and supply is getting better. But to put it in a bit of context, everybody's heard recently about the plastic issue and climate change. That issue was around 35 years ago, or probably even 40. I can remember writing essays on it to do with environmental studies, etc. That is the scale of the current housing crisis. We can keep filling around at the edges, we can keep tinkering with the planning system and blame the planners and blame the system, but unless you have a more radical, and I know the government doesn't like the word radical, so let's call it a significant change in where we are, that you need to tackle the sale of land, you need to tackle values, and what happens to that increase in value from when it gets planning permission to do what. You need to tackle the industry as a whole. It needs labour, it needs materials, it needs to deal with social care, it needs to do with housing issues to do with affordability, etc., and housing benefits, etc. But unless you tackle some of those big issues, we don't have a national plan per se across the country. We deal with little bits of infrastructure at the time. We deal with what's good politically, Cambridge, Oxford, Arc, etc. There's much bigger issues. So why aren't we tackling those difficult questions of land value capture, the sale of land, and the tax system? Because all of those big issues and hard issues, if you dealt with those, then you could tackle the crisis properly. What does the panel think?
Yeah, so that's really good contribution. We've got a gentleman there, and then we'll take the gentleman here, and then we'll just mop up on those, and then we'll do the other questions.
Hello, my name is Oladipo Saga. This is a question for Bob. I'm in the Sustainable Urban Development Masters, and we had a lecture today about social housing here. And it was looking at Brazil, and it looks like long term, most social housing built and end up being slums and not places people want to raise kids. You know, but you said just now that in the 60s, some social housing was built and they've lasted till now and they're still good. Could you give us the features of social housing that, how they should be built so long run they become places people want to live and raise kids?
Okay, well, we've got some really big issues there.
Yeah, Matthew Hardy, Senior Lecturer from the Prince's Foundation, and an Aussie, as you can probably tell by the accent. My question really comes from experience of my part of Australia in the 60s and 70s had a housing corporation, which was a state-funded body, which built public housing, which was both social housing and housing for sale. And I wonder, we've heard of a national education service in the last series of manifestos that came out. I wonder if it's time for a national housing service.
So some direct questions there about, should planners just be allowed to rule the world? Secondly, should, much more fundamental issues around land values and taxation. Bob, a specific issue for you about social housing. I've got to say, I've got a view on that myself. In my borough, we've got some utterly fantastic mansion blocks, which most people would just die to live in, which are social housing. And we've got some utterly dreadful tower blocks, which are social housing. They're both social housing. Some of them are fantastic places to live in, others are not. And that doesn't mean that social housing is bad. So, and then we've got that final issue as well about should we have a national housing service. Right. So I'm going to start with you, Bob. Can you all be brief in your answers?
It's almost impossible to do justice to these issues. I can't do justice to the question about what's the magic, that's the wrong word, what is the formula for delivering sustainable housing, but we can see that good design, that strong services, that mixed tenure and mixed communities, strong transport infrastructure, all of these things go to creating great housing that lasts. It can be done, and we have plenty of examples in this country of how we've done it well. What it does mean is you have to change the way you think about the task and the professions involved, and they need to work in a much more integrated way than historically. And I actually think, which brings me on to the planning issue, and I'm pleased to hear that planning is working well, but taken in the round, I think the planning service has been really pushed back in a way by the reductions in funding and the capacity, and planners have had their role reduced to the transactional, very often the transactional development control task, rather than what the original conception of planners was about creating great places. And I do think a big issue is about the capacity and funding of our planning services and allowing that wider role to be restored to its kind of proper place. Which kind of brings me on to this thing about, is the solution relaxing the planning system? I tell you, I must have been through, in my time, 10 different planning reviews. Every minister comes in and says, let's review the planning system, let's review the planning system. If that was the answer, we would be building incredible numbers of houses by now. It isn't. It's exactly as Yolande says. To do this big supply, you have to think big and deliver big. And that's not about do development control, agree to this or that scheme on this or that terms. It's about big investment, big return, imagination from government. And if we're thinking about a national housing service, I don't think you deliver all the houses through a national service. I think that's not the answer. What you need is a government that puts housing absolutely at the centre genuinely of its policies, and simply changing the name, if I can be a bit provocative here, to the Housing and Local Government Department doesn't quite cut it. It is a shift, it is a paradigm shift in the way we see the importance of housing and housing supply that's needed here. And without that, we'll be having this meeting again in 5-10 years' time.
Just one, and for me it comes back to this sort of rather fundamental theme that around whether it's about empowering places or really getting to the root of some of these challenges beyond the technical or operational, and that is about having in place and really believing in a credible, participative, democratic approach to these decisions, and that you've got to have that core belief that will always, or that the vast majority of times that does result in better decisions being made. You need a government that has the ambition to enable that, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And whilst I don't want to say until we have a government in place that can really carry a lead on seismic change, that we should all give up, because of course that would be to surrender to helplessness. But we do need to push hard for that. And just on the point of the sort of national housing service idea, I think you need to get the balance right of making sure that it reaches that level of urgency and importance and a shared national agenda, but at the same time make sure that you're there, not at the same time taking away the agency of communities and people to come together locally to address an issue that is so integral to them.
Thanks. And Yolande, if you could really cover the issue of land values, etc., I think that would be really helpful.
Later on, I think we probably needed a day or two or a couple of weeks or something for this. But I think what I want to say is that when it comes to planning, I think I take Bob's point about the breakdown of silos. I see individuals in the industry in all sorts of different areas as individuals really genuinely wanting to do something good, and somehow once it goes, development goes through the process, it ends up, let's call it suboptimal. And I think one of the things we talk about a lot at the new Bartlett Real Estate Institute is about breaking down silos and having people talk together. I think the key thing about planning is that we have to turn it on its head. We talk about master planning far too often. That is about experts doing things to people. Absolutely with the best intentions. It's about time we talked about servant planning, and actually the planning enabling and the designers enabling communities and people to build their own communities. It's amazing how some of the poorest people in the world build really good places. I'm not romanticising lack of sanitation or poverty or whatever, but in terms of urbanism, people are very good at knowing what works for their communities. We've just got to let them take control, and planning should be about enabling that to happen.
Great point. So, lady here wanted to make a comment.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was really good. I'm a student here, but I'm involved with 2 radical housing projects actually embarking. So I've got a million questions I'd like to ask Bartlett at some point. But I've got a more general question about the bleakness of the situation at the moment, because from my point of view, and my friends who are also involved with radical housing issues in London, it feels very bleak. We've had 10 years now of stagnant economy after the subprime mortgage crisis. And I have this sort of gut feeling that with pretty much the only on-paper growth in the economy being generated by absurd house price and land value inflation, we've got this choice going forward if either this government, which clearly has no interest whatsoever in providing sustainable and affordable housing, or an alternative government, whether that be Labour or Conservative, who are going to be utterly desperate to cling on to any morsel of growth in the economy as Brexit sets in, as the economy continues to stagnate. So the question is generally, like, can this be done? Can we genuinely do this? Is it reasonable to take profit out of housing, to do it meaningfully, and to get people on board who are utterly obsessed with continued unending economic growth?
So there was a woman at the back, I think, who put her hand up at one point. Yeah.
Hiya, I'm a student at Kellogg here. My question is mostly for Paul. As the CEO of a local, as the CEO of a local Oxford-based charity, I want to know what more you think this university could be doing to support the development of local affordable housing, whether or not that be for students or people who work at the university, because I personally come from the belief that universities should serve the communities that they are based in. So yeah, what more can this university be doing in Oxford?
That's a great question too. And I think there was a gentleman at the back somewhere, or has everybody who wanted to ask a question done so? Yes, they have. So really, the 2 questions, one of which specifically for you, Paul. So if you'd like to answer that question, and then I'll pass over to Bob and Yolande to answer the other question about taking the profit out of housing.
Happily, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. I think there are a number of ways that the university and its colleges could engage in a very sort of constructive way on this, and some of them are very simple. So first of all, is to pay a genuine living wage to all of your staff, and particularly those who run the facilities, the catering, etc., and to make sure as students that your colleges are paying that wage, to make sure that everybody in your college can afford to live and enjoy Oxford. I think that's quite a simple argument. I think the Living Wage Foundation has some very compelling statistics and case studies as to why that would be a benefit for the college as much as for the individuals. And to note, a number of colleges do, of course, pay the living wage or higher. I think it's also about talking to your college about how they procure their services. So making sure that they have a social procurement policy. So are they actively seeking out every opportunity to have some sort of social outcome locally through how they procure every aspect of the services that they need as one of the anchor organisations in this city to run their services. So it could be about who does their catering, who does their gardening, who does all of these sort of services, and what are those suppliers doing, and what wages are they paying, and making sure that they are setting the example and raising the bar on that. There's also, I've mentioned when I was speaking about the meanwhile use of unused premises, and it sort of speaks to a point that the other lady made in her question around having a sense of not being too helpless, because there are some really inspiring projects happening that can demonstrate potential. So I'm a co-director of a project called Make Space. We've engaged with Wadham College around bringing back into meanwhile use an empty commercial premises, which is now a thriving community enterprise hub in Jericho. You know, it shows the potential there. I'm a trustee of another project called Flo's Place in the Park. So we brought back into use an empty children's centre, again, a new community enterprise hub in East Oxford. So there are examples out there of what can be done with currently underused premises. And I think if colleges could buy into that journey more and enable that would be fantastic. And also as students to call for your colleges to make sure that they are engaging in that conversation. And finally, there is an issue around investment. Colleges, they are charitable institutions, so there may be barriers around obviously making donations and grants, but they can invest, and they've got incredible endowments that they manage and need to see a return on those investments, but that doesn't preclude them from making social investments and making investments that can really change the dynamic in this city. And there are billions of pounds there that the colleges and the university as an institution could look at. Well, how could they, twinning with a divestment policy from various nefarious industries, that they could put that money into something really quite impressive locally.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Yolande, taking profit out of housing.
Well, you have to be very careful here what you wish for. History is littered with good intentions, especially when it comes to real estate taxes that completely backfire and have perverse and opposite impacts. I think, having said that, though, we should undoubtedly be looking at value that is conferred, as it were, by public activity upon private individuals, and find better ways of capturing that, probably in partnership rather than against, because you have to be very careful of removing any incentive of anybody to actually build or do anything if you do it the wrong way. There is, and this is another subject for morning's conference, I think, but one thing I do wonder about, and I know it's thought of at international levels, I know IMF and others, is whether the public sector, as well as having a current account, the deficit and the debt and all that, should actually also be measuring a balance sheet. And we should actually start as a nation valuing what we own and what we invest in and what we make and how we add value to all that. And I think that might make building and owning good social housing and good places make a difference, maybe a bit easier. Question, that's my idea. The other thing is to actually understand that the business models that have been employed in the past to deliver housing very often work against the long-term sort of community values that we've been talking about. And the role of long-term patient equity and the creation of long-term income streams, the global appetite for that sort of investment in future will, to some extent, help that.
Thanks very much indeed. I think we had some fantastic contributions and really good questions as well this evening, and we could go on forever. However, we've overrun already. So I'm going to just finish by asking Bob, can we make a difference and can we solve this housing crisis?
Blimey. I mean, my short kind of view is yes. I wouldn't kind of be so committed to the housing world if I didn't believe there are solutions. Of course, there's all sorts of caveats about the level of build we had in the past, but the truth is we did it. At points of crisis, the country has responded to the challenge it faced, and it can do so again. On the wider point about can we deliver a fair, prosperous and a fair economy, I mentioned the Commission for Economic Justice. I think that is the first effort I've been involved in to seriously answer that question and how we might move from where we are now to where we want to be. And I would really commend people to read it. It's not one simple answer, but there are some things that could make a real difference in this country. And just quickly on this question of house builders, I do want to say a word about that, because I'd actually think there is a need for house builders and those who make profit. And if you go back, of course, to the crash, they very nearly disappeared. I mean, the problem in this country has been the over-reliance on that one business model to deliver what we need. And that is the point here. It's not, do we need a vibrant private sector? I think we do. But if that's the sole thing we focus on, and not on the wider public and community interventions that make a difference, then we end up where we are now. So it's about, there is hope here. We're not all doomed in this question, but it can't be done by the private sector alone. Never could be and never will be. The state has a role, the active state has a role, and of course the state gets things wrong sometimes, but it also gets a lot right as well, and so do communities. It's all three need to be given their proper place in this agenda. And I'm happy to talk about Barking Dagenham when we have a drink. I'm desperate for it.
As on that note of Bob's alcoholism, we'll end this evening, but would you join with me for thanking our three very